Hello everyone, how's it going? My name is Peter, and this is a simplified intro to web development. My goal with this video, and the videos in this series, isn't to go super in depth into all the concepts in web development and all the different technologies, because there's a bazillion of them out there, and some people make their entire career around this. There's no way to cover all of that in a few videos. Instead, I just want to get across the core concepts of web development and I guess the internet in general. And hopefully that'll give you a deeper understanding and appreciation of how the internet works in your day-to-day life. And if you want to build a website yourself, it'll give you a good head start on it. So the first question we have to address is, what is the internet actually? I know it sounds like a very simple question, but the internet's something we use in our everyday lives, and we don't really think about it that much. We don't really consider how it works. It's just there. We use it on our computers, we use it on our phones, we use it on smartwatches if you have those. And there's all kinds of different smart gadgets now. Internet-enabled thermometers, internet-enabled alarm clocks. All of these use the internet. So what the internet is actually is it's a system of computer networks that can communicate with each other. Thanks to the internet, you're able to watch this video now. And so you can do all sorts of cool things on the internet. You can send information back and forth. You can write emails, share files, and hopefully not get hacked by a virus that someone sent you. And as I said before, it's accessible on all sorts of devices. Now, the most common way to access the internet is through a website. And what is a website exactly? A website is a collection of web pages and other things that can do cool stuff. Well, most of them do cool stuff. Some of them are just there. That's not really a requirement. Essentially, these web pages are put on the internet, and anyone with the URL can go look at them and interact with them. But how does it work exactly? How do we access websites? Now, I know the simple and obvious answer is, let's go type in a URL. We type in twitter.com, youtube.com, google.com, and voila, all the data from that website just appears. But that's abstracting away a lot of what's actually going on behind the scenes. When you're on the internet, there's two types of computers. You have the client and you have the server. Now, the client is what you use to access data. It's your iPhone, it's your laptop, it's your computer. And a server is what's actually sending you the data. The computers that store the data and get requests and send information back. Hence the name, the server. It's serving you data, like a waiter serves food. And so when you type a URL, you, the client, are requesting information from a particular server. And what server that is depends on the URL you type. Although a cool trivia fact is, the URL isn't actually recognized by the system of computer networks. What's actually happening is it's being converted into an IP address behind the scenes. And the IP address, as you can see down here, is a series of numbers. And this is actually the unique identifier that a website goes by. The only problem is, no one wants to memorize a series of numbers. They'd much rather memorize something like google.com. So we hide the series of numbers and use website domain names instead. Anyway, you send a request to the server, and the server gives you a response with hopefully the data that you wanted. And so let's get into the structure of what it's sending back. The first thing to know is it's going to send back some HTML. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Query Language. And it's a way to structure your web pages and your content in files. And so what HTML does is it creates a tree structure for every web page. And these tree structures are composed of elements. We can see right here in the example code, this is what a basic HTML statement looks like. We have the element here, P stands for paragraph. We have the closing tag. That's the opening tag, sorry, I'm blind. This is the closing tag. And in between the opening and closing tag, we have the content. And so what this is saying is this is an element of that's a paragraph containing my cat is very grumpy, and it ends here. And so there are all sorts of elements. It's a language after all. The elements are like your alphabet. And what HTML does is, depending on how you type these elements together and how you move them around in the file, it generates a tree structure. And that tree structure forms the basis of any web page. So you can see here, there's body element, div element, some header elements, h1, some paragraph elements, all sorts of elements. And they form this kind of tree where you're going down and each element contains more elements. Next, CSS, Cascading Style Sheet. These files are files that let you change the style of your HTML pages. So what does that mean? What's the style? The style is basically how your HTML elements behave and how they look. So an example of a CSS statement would be this. We have the selector, here it's P, and that tells us to select all P, or paragraph elements, in the HTML file. And we're telling it to set the color property to red. So if we were to apply this CSS statement, we would see that some paragraph, all the paragraphs actually, because we're selecting just P paragraphs, in our HTML file would go from black to red. Next we have JavaScript. JavaScript is the first programming language we're actually talking about. HTML and CSS, those were not programming languages. This is a programming language. And what this language is designed to do is it's going to make your website interactive. You can make a website without it, just using HTML and CSS, but your website probably couldn't do a lot, which is fine, I guess, if that's what you want. But generally, for larger websites, more complicated websites, what people do is they use JavaScript. And JavaScript is a very flexible language. What it does is it can interact with these things called APIs, application programming interfaces, which are just packages of code made by other people. So you don't have to do a lot of the work. You can just go find the work that other people have done and add it to your website. And there's a very large community around it because almost every website nowadays needs JavaScript. And so what can it actually do? It can do things like display the date. It can make it so your website changes color when you click on a button. It can draw a painting if you want. Anything you can think of, you can probably do the basics with JavaScript on your website. And so the things we covered before, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, form what's known as the front end of any website. And the front end is called the front end because it's the end of the website that the users are actually seeing and interacting with. It's the buttons, the animations, the videos, any chats, all that jazz. And so to make these things easier, there are a lot of frameworks that people have developed out there. And these frameworks are meant to help you build dynamic websites and dynamic front ends. And just overall give you an easier experience with making a website. We're not going to cover them all because there are too many to count. And generally, they're all pretty useful in their own ways. Some of the more popular ones are AngularJS, this big A symbol, Vue, this V, React, and Ember. You can look up documentation on what each of these things does, and if you can decide whether you like it and whether you want to use it or not. They're all pretty good in their own way. Next, we're going to cover the backend. The backend is the part of your website that the user doesn't see. When your user goes to your website, any code that runs on the server to support your website, that's classified as the backend. It's how the website's storing and accessing data. It's any calculations the website might have to perform. If it might have to do user authentication and allow for user registration and logins. Or if you want to route traffic to a particular part of your website or slow down traffic, all of that stuff is the backend because the user's not seeing it. The user's only seeing what you're showing them, but in the background, all these things are happening. And so the backend also has a couple of frameworks. Some of the most popular ones are Django, which is written in a programming language called Python, and Node.js, which is actually also written in JavaScript. And now we can go to some examples. So, in the beginning of the internet, there was no internet. And then, a couple of years later, there was an internet. And on this internet, people usually just shared documents. This is one example. It's just a web page with some words. Some pretty nice words, but just some words. But eventually, people decided that they wanted more. And that's where all the stuff I talked about previously came in. And so I'm just going to give you a quick demonstration of what an HTML file and CSS file actually look like. So here we have the most basic of basics HTML files. This is the starter. And so what it has is, it has a doc type. This just tells us that it's an HTML file, and it tells the computer that it's an HTML file. We're setting the language. And then we have this element here called head. And so what head does is it puts all the information that's not directly displayed to the user, but it's part of the web page. All that stuff goes into head. For example, the title of the document is just document. But if we change it to something like my document, and save, and then we come here and refresh, we'll see the title up here has now become my document. And then the body is just all the stuff in the main web page. And that's how HTML is structured. If we want, we can add a new element. We can add a header, for example. We'll put the opening tag, the closing tag, and in between we'll put what the header actually says. For example, my header. And if we refresh the page again, we will see my header. Now you might have noticed that this paragraph, this is my page, is actually red. And nowhere in here did we tell it that paragraphs are going to be red. But this is connected to a CSS file. And we can see that right here. In the head, we link it. We tell it that the file relation is a style sheet because CSS stands for cascading style sheet. And we reference a CSS file. And in this CSS file, we just have the same thing I showed in the presentation earlier. We tell it that paragraphs are going to be red by selecting the element paragraph and setting the color to be red inside. If we were to do something else, if we told it that the paragraph was green, then we will see a green paragraph here. And so that's the most basic of basics of how HTML and CSS work. Obviously, there's a lot of more elements, a lot of more complicated topics, but those things, generally there's pretty good documentation for if you go on the internet. And so I'll only cover the basics, and if you want to learn more, you can just Google it and build your own HTML file and try playing around with it. It'll be a good learning experience. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate it. I will hopefully see you again soon for my next tutorial. All right, have a good day.